Good morning. My name's Aaron. I'm one of the pastors here at Ocean View. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I'm glad that you're here in the room. And I know there's lots of people watching online as well who are maybe traveling this week, getting to go be with family. When I was a kid, and even to this day, books are just part of my life's rhythm. That's just how it goes. I remember going to the library when I was a kid, and I would just come back with stacks of books, and that translated. Even as I got older, one of my favorite things to do is to go to an old bookstore and just be there, surrounded by lots and lots of books. I don't even have to buy anything. A good day for me is like, hey, kids, let's go to the library. Why? I don't know. Let's just do it and just hang out. For me, that's a fun thing. In college, if I had spare time, that's where I would be. I would be at a used bookstore in town, rummaging through the basement, through the stacks on the main floor. It's like 3 stories high. I can think of I know where everything is in that store. I can still see it. I can smell it to this day. This is just part of my nature. I love books. And even when Whitney and I got married, one of our things we would do on Saturday mornings before we even had kids, because we loved children's books especially so much, is we would go get a cup of coffee and then walk down the street to this used bookstore, and we would buy stacks of picture books, stacks of them. I have hundreds in my house, even to this day, because I love books. And from the time my kids were born, we started reading to them every single night. We still do. And it's not uncommon for one of my kids to say, hey, can we just read one more story? And it's not uncommon for us to say, okay, one more, because we are just obsessed. It's just part of our rhythm in our family. Over the last several weeks, we have been looking at 6 things that every family needs over time. And these are things that probably are already happening in your life or in the life of your family. But what we said is that when we take time to actually look at them, we might have an opportunity to amplify them and be a little more intentional with them. So if you've missed any of these over the last couple weeks, go online. You can go on YouTube. You can watch those and get caught up. But for a quick recap, here's what we've kind of said, is in week 1, we looked at 2 things. We said that love over time gives a family worth and gives kids worth. Love over time establishes that, hey, you are valuable and what we have together matters. We also said that time over time gives a history worth repeating. And we talked about how the more time that we have and the more that we invest in that time and we see how much time we have left makes us want to do more with the time that we have now. And so investing in that allows us to repeat that over time. Last week, we learned that words over time can give direction and the importance of the words and what we say and what we don't say with our kids. And then also, last week, we talked about how fun over time can actually build connection and sometimes even repair things that maybe have been disconnected. And so if you missed any of those, go online, watch those. Hopefully this past week, you were maybe a little more intentional with your words and your relationships, and hopefully even you were able to carve out time and be intentional in having fun with your family and your loved ones this past week. If not this week, there's a big holiday. You have an opportunity to kind of make good on that, yeah? If you don't fall asleep first, that's the trick. So we're talking about these ideas. Today we're going to continue on that theme, but if you remember, we started this by looking at a jar of marbles, and we said that from the time a kid is born until the time they graduate college, we have this jar of over 900 marbles, and each week it's like we're taking a marble out, and we can see how much time we have left. And we said, when we see how much time we have left, we'll be more intentional with the time that we have now. Now, maybe you're like, oh, my kids are out and grown. Well, maybe you have grandkids, or maybe you have cousins, or maybe you have nieces or nephews or siblings. I don't know what it might be for you, but my guess is that within the context of your family, there is somebody that you need to build connection with. And no matter your age or what phase you are in, these principles remain true, not just for kids and not just for students, but for any family, with your spouse, with loved ones. When you see how much time you have left, you tend to do more and be more intentional with the time that you have now. I don't carry around jars of marbles for my kids. I don't, that would be very heavy. So what we do have, though, is something called the Parent Cue app. And we encourage all of our parents, if you're a parent of a kid or a student or a grandparent, whatever it might be, whoever's in your life, to download this because you can see exactly how much time you have left. And it cues you to be more intentional with the time you have now. Here's a snapshot from my phone of what it looks like for my kids. I have Graham, Maisie, and Emmy here. Graham's my oldest. You can see on that circle that his time is over halfway gone, right? So when they're born, that circle's full, and each week it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so he's already over, he's 10. So I am on the back end of the time that I have there. Maisie, my daughter, who's my second, she is almost at the halfway mark. She's getting baptized today. I'm super excited about that. That's in our next service. And then Emmy, we've gone a quarter of the way through her time. So if you're a parent of a student or a kid, grandparent, uncle, aunt, whatever, download that, put in their birth date, and see how much time you have left before they move on to what is next. Parents see this a lot of times, and they're like, oh, I don't want that. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to see it, right? But, again, it's true. If we look at how much time we have left, maybe we'll be more intentional with the time we have now. I told you earlier that stories, books growing up were a part of my rhythm, and they still are today. And today we're going to look at these last two ideas of what these two things over time in our family, what they can do in us and in our relationships as we try to follow Jesus. Today we're going to look at stories over time. And when you think of stories, maybe you think of books, you might think of a movie, you might think of something that maybe was critical for you growing up. So here's a question: what stories shaped you? When I say, hey, what stories shaped you? Maybe you've never paused long enough to consider that question. Now, I did this week because I knew I was going to ask it. So I was like, wait, what stories shaped me? So I put some pen to paper and tried to think about this, and then 3 really rose to the top really fast. So I'm going to share those with you. Stories that shaped me, one is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I loved this book when I was a kid. I've read it 100 times. I love it so much. I loved the movie too, but I really loved this book. And it's this idea, man, like, how did it shape you? Well, let me just share one passage with you. The Scarecrow is talking with Dorothy. Now, in the book, Kansas is written as a very dark, gray, bland place. And she goes to Oz. Dorothy then goes to Oz, which, as you know, is just crazy. There's all kinds of stuff happening there. And so in this conversation that the Scarecrow has with Dorothy, this is what the Scarecrow says. The Scarecrow says to Dorothy, I cannot understand why you should wish to leave this beautiful country and go back to the dry, gray place that you call Kansas. And Dorothy says, that is because you have no brains. No matter how dreary and gray our homes are, we people of flesh and blood would rather live there than in any other country, be it ever so beautiful. There is no place like home. You know it. Can you imagine growing up without that in your mind and in your heart? Like, that shapes me, right? Like, there's no place like home. That idea that no matter where you go in this world, how grand it might be, there's something different about belonging at home, right? Another story that kind of shaped me as I was growing up is Charlotte's Web. I remember the first time I read this book, my first grade teacher read it to me. And she read it to our whole class like a little bit each day. And you might say, well, how did that shape you? Well, I'm just going to share one piece with you. And this is, again, just if you've never read it, I highly encourage you to, or read it to your kids as well. No matter your age, it's great. But if you don't know the story, it's about a spider named Charlotte who befriends a pig named Wilbur. Wilbur is destined for the bacon block, and Charlotte rescues him through interesting ways. But at the end of this, Wilbur, the pig, asks Charlotte the spider, why did you do all of this for me? I don't deserve it. I've never done anything for you. And Charlotte says, you have been my friend. That in itself is a tremendous thing. I wove my webs for you because I liked you. After all, what's a life anyway? We're born, we live a little while, we die. A spider's life can't help being something of a mess with all this trapping and eating flies. By helping you, perhaps I was trying to lift up my life a trifle. Heaven knows anyone's life can stand a little of that. It's this idea of sacrificing yourself for someone else, this idea of understanding that your life is only here for a little while. What does it mean to live your life to help somebody else live theirs? And then the last one that I can remember is Peter Pan. I love the story of Peter Pan. I love this book. I've read this one 100 times as well. In fact, I read it to my kids when they were born. Every single one of my kids was the first book that I read to them because they couldn't wrestle out of my arms. Like, we're going to read it. And it's this wonderful story, obviously, about Peter Pan, a boy who never wants to grow up. But the whole message of it is that, listen, maybe growing up is the bravest thing that you can do. Maybe to live a full life is an awfully big adventure. What does that do for us? See, here's the thing. When I say what stories shaped you, you understand that stories over time, they give you perspective. They help you see the world in a different way. Stories give us perspective. And so when you think about the stories that maybe shaped you, what stories gave you perspective as you were growing up? And maybe your life would be different if those stories weren't there. There's been some research done that when kids read stories, or even adults, when we find ourselves engrossed in a story, what we actually do is we put ourselves in the story and we begin to feel the feelings of those characters. We identify with what they are going through. And even though maybe we've never experienced what they've experienced, we begin to understand the world differently. See, stories help us have empathy. And who should have more empathy than Christ's followers on this earth? People who understand that people are messy. And maybe if we're going to be good followers of Jesus, we need to understand what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, because that, after all, is what Jesus did for us. He stepped into our world and took on flesh. And he lived as one of us, so he could relate to us in a completely different way. What would it be like for us to understand that stories give us perspective? We would care more about other people. We would see more. We would be able to have hope more, and not just for ourselves, but to be able to share that for other people. See, you and I, we were created for stories. Maybe we don't think about it that way, but we are actually created for stories, not only to receive stories, not only to recognize stories, not only to just be like completely enamored with stories, whether it's a movie, whether it's a micro story on somebody's Instagram feed or whatever it might be. See, we're wired for stories, but also we are created for God's story as well. And so we have a part to play in that story. It's no wonder then that God used story to kind of communicate his love and plan for us, right? And putting all of these stories together, he communicates an overarching plan for you and I to be able to understand his story and our part in it. We're created for story. So we need them. We need stories from our own family. And when I say that, maybe you can think of stories in your family. We're about to gather around Thanksgiving tables, right? Back with friends, with family, and there's going to be a lot of stories shared. There's going to be a lot of memories, a lot of laughter, maybe some heartache as well. But we need those stories, because here's what stories do for us. They give us perspective. A few weeks ago, I helped with the children's theater in town, Myrtle Beach Area Children's Theater. We put on a production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which was really fun. And it just reminded me so much of the story of Joseph. But in this show, if you're familiar with this musical, you basically hear every song in this show 3 times. This is just how it is. It's told, it's retold, and it's told again. So it kind of leaves you with like these songs over and over and over again. And I remember in one of our rehearsals, someone said, well, why does this keep repeating? And the reason it keeps repeating is because that's exactly how the story of Joseph was told for so many years. If you don't remember, Joseph grew up knowing that one day, through a dream, he was going to rule over his brothers, his sisters, his father, his parents, all of that. He didn't understand how it was going to happen. His brothers resented that. They sold him into slavery. He ends up finding himself in prison, and then he finds himself second in command over all of Egypt. And then there's a famine that comes, and his brothers, who had long ago thrown him away, show up at his feet saying, please, can we have food? And they didn't recognize him. And finally, he reveals himself and says, this is all part of a much bigger plan. Who knew how all of this would unfold? Here's what Joseph said in Genesis chapter 50. He said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. See, all of this was part of a much bigger story. What's interesting about the story of Joseph is that Joseph lived his life knowing the promise of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob, knowing that God was going to build a nation through his family line, knowing that somehow God's promise to him was going to come to fruition. But he didn't know how. And then in this moment, he understands, oh, this is what God meant. But here's the thing. 400 years go by, and this story is being told from one generation to the next. During that 400 years, as this story is being shared from one generation to the next, this family line expands and grows, but at the same time is put into slavery. And they are enslaved to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And after 400 years, God's people cry out. Why do they cry out? They cry out because they have heard the story. They know the promise. They remember God's faithfulness in Joseph's life, and it causes them to have a hope in a big God that they can trust in that moment as well. And then Moses is raised and leads them out of slavery. I think what's not written there is so important, that story was told and retold again and again and again from one generation to the next. So here's a couple of questions for you as you approach this week and as we think about our families. How has God shown his faithfulness for your family? How have you trusted God when it was hard? How did you come to know Jesus? These are questions that we can answer with our family, with our kids, with our students, that they see us wrestling with faith, that they see us like, hey, not everything has been great all the time. There have been some low moments. There have been times when I questioned God's promises, and yet he has proven himself faithful again and again and again. That's a story worth sharing. We need those stories. If you've ever been on a mission trip, you know that you come back with a story to tell, and it inspires others to tell their story. Even something as simple as we've done this week, maybe you packed a shoebox and maybe you're tracking to see where it goes. Why? Because there's a story attached to that box. Even recently in looking at Conway and saying, hey, let's plant a campus over there. How many people can we reach? What stories might we tell? Well, that starts with the story of our families sacrificing and saying, hey, we're going to give towards that. Does your family know about that? Are they going to see God's faithfulness in your sacrifice and obedience to him? And whatever you're doing in obedience to what God has called you to do. See, we need stories from our family because it gives us a different perspective on who God is. We also need stories from the Bible. Of course we do, right? We talked last week about God's word and how important that is and the words that we share with our kids. We need those stories to understand who God is. You understand that when Jesus came, God's perfect son, when he stepped into flesh, when he became man just like you and I, he didn't teach rules and regulations. That had already been done. And everybody had found the loopholes. Everyone had found the workarounds. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, they knew all the ins and outs. They knew how to work the system, just like people do today with laws, right? We understand, okay, that's a great tax law. How do I get around it, right? Like, what's the loophole for it? And so Jesus steps in, and he doesn't teach rules and regulations. In fact, he teaches through story, because it's hard to argue with a story. There's something about a story that connects our heart to the heart of God as well. In fact, he would often teach in stories so many times that it would leave people with nothing to question. Mark wrote it this way. In Mark chapter 4, he noted that with many similar parables, those stories, Jesus spoke the word to them, meaning he's speaking the word of life to them through story as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his own disciples, then he explained everything. See, stories connected the heart of the Father to the heart of his creation. And so he would use stories again and again to express his Father's love for us, to express what forgiveness is like, to express what true joy is. You can't find a loophole in a really good story. It resonates. You understand it differently. Jesus revealed that to us. So we need stories from the Bible. We need stories from our family to show us who God is. And we have to tell them, repeat them again and again and again. And here's the thing. We talked about words last week, but this is more than just good morals. As we said last week, we have to know God's words and instill them into our children, because it's not just good behavior we're after. It's not just encouraging words. It's not just, cat posters where the cat's like hanging on the branch, like, hang in there. It's more than that. What we're after is a complete investment in the eternal life of somebody else. The psalmist wrote it this way in Psalm 78. The psalmist wrote this: "My people, hear my teaching, listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children." Why? So the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Again, it's just again and again and again. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal, to whose spirits were not faithful to him. See, stories over time, they give us perspective. They're able to shape us. That all the mistakes made in one generation hopefully are not repeated in the next one, when we understand who God is, when we understand his faithfulness, when we understand his promises, when we understand his forgiveness. We need stories over time to give us perspective. And when we see how much time we have left, we'll be more intentional with the stories that we are writing now and that we are being a part of now. The last thing that we need, again, this is just to amplify what we already hopefully have. And if we don't, hopefully we can grasp it and understand it differently. The last one is tribes over time. When I say tribes, maybe you have different ideas. What we're really saying is a tight-knit group of people. And you know that. You have people in your life. Like when things go awry, when there's chaos ensuing, when you have something to celebrate, there's that first group of people that you're like, they're my people. I'm going to tell them first. They're going to encourage me. They're going to speak words of wisdom to me. See, tribes over time give us a sense of belonging. And we all need a place to belong. So as we pursue belonging, what does that do for us? Tribes over time give us belonging. We all want a place to belong. And here's the thing about that. That's not like a one and done thing. Anytime we enter a new space or a new phase, we want a place to belong. I know we have lots of people here that have moved from other places in the country. And you've picked Myrtle Beach, you threw a dart at a map and you landed here. Like, how did this happen? And you come here, and the first thing that you look for, right, besides living arrangements, you're like, man, who are going to be my people? Where's my tribe? Who can I identify with? Because you've entered a new space or a new phase. Maybe you just recently had kids, or maybe your kids just went to college. Or maybe you just had some other kind of relationship change. Maybe you were just married, or maybe you went through a dark period of your life. I'm not sure what it might be. Those two things are not related, by the way. Getting married in a dark period, just realized, not tying those together. But when we enter new spaces and new phases, we tend to look for our community. We tend to look for a place to belong. And you meet people who are entering new spaces and you meet people who are moving here from other places, or maybe you're meeting people who are starting a new job and you're saying, all right, they're looking for a place to belong. Let me invite them into the community. Let me invite them into a space, hopefully like Ocean View, where you can connect and belong. And I'll just say this, fitting in is not belonging. Maybe you've experienced that growing up. Maybe you experience it now, even as an adult, where you work, where you feel like you have to fit in. You try to change something about yourself to fit in. That's not the same thing as belonging. Belonging, you see, is different. Belonging means I can have a bad day around some people, and it's okay. Nobody's going to judge me or think differently of me. Belonging, it's in the word be. You just be there, and hopefully for a long time, you belong. It's a place where you can have a bad day, where you can mess up and experience forgiveness, where you can say, hey, this is going on in my world, and someone's going to not just listen and commiserate, but they're going to listen and point you to hope. Where someone's going to come alongside you and say, all right, let's pray through that. Or, hey, that's okay, I've experienced that too, and do you know what God's faithfulness taught me? And you share a story. See, a place to belong allows us to experience all of the things that we've experienced through Jesus, we now share together. Jesus told a story once about a son who took his father's inheritance and then squandered it. We talked about this a few months ago. We commonly refer to it as the prodigal son. In everything, he takes all of this riches, he completely wastes his money, and he finds himself and he realizes, I need to go home. Maybe my dad will take me back as a servant. At least they ate better than I'm eating now. And so he goes all the way back home, and his father rushes off the porch to greet him, wraps his arms around him, forgives him, and more than that, puts a ring on his finger to show that, hey, you're still part of the family. You're not going to be a servant. You belong in the family. And then he calls all the servants. He said, guys, we're going to throw a party. And everybody comes to show that not only is he part of the family, he's still part of the community of people that are there. See, a tribe reminds us that we belong to God and that we belong together. In all of our mishaps and all of our mistakes, when we need forgiveness and grace, we're able to give it because we have been shown it. And we're able to receive it because we've received it from Jesus himself. And so we are able to share in that. That is what the church is meant to be. That's what we are meant to be for one another, a tribe where anyone can belong. And anyone can belong because Jesus died for everyone. And so everyone has the opportunity to belong. We see it in the early church. In Acts, we've read this before, but all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything that they had. And with great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, and they brought the money from the sales, and they put it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to anyone who had need. It means that nobody was in need. Everything was shared. When it says they shared in everything, it doesn't mean just physical possessions. It also means in their victories, in their failures, in their struggles, and what they were facing in their life. Do you have people in your life that are your circle, that are in your tribe, that can come alongside of you and extend open arms? I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that we have people in our life that when we're going through something, we can call them up and we can be honest. And they'll point us to hope. They'll point us back to Jesus. I'm so thankful that we have people in this room who are serving right now and some that are going to serve in the next hour with our kids and our student ministries that create space for kids to ask questions. That creates space for adults to ask questions with our neighborhood groups. Where people can come and belong and they can say, I'm not sure about this, and they're not going to be judged. Instead, they're going to be welcomed. And when they mess up, they're going to be forgiven. A space where someone like my daughter can say, hey, I want to follow Jesus, and she can take that step and have adults in her life who are going to point her towards Jesus that are not mom and dad, because every kid needs that. And because of that, she's taking a step today. to go public with that? Are you creating space in your life for someone else to belong? In other words, do you have an open seat in your circle? Or is it just kind of closed off? When we think of Thanksgiving, even this week, and we think of family and friends and people that we're going to see, maybe some people we don't want to see, whatever it might be, is there an open seat for them to have a place to belong? That's what following Jesus is about, is that we always have an open seat for someone to belong. And there's an open seat for you as well to belong. Maybe that means you need to take a step and say, all right, I've been resistant to this. I need to step into a neighborhood group. I need to step into serving on a team to create a space for someone else to belong. Maybe you have a story to share, to tell, and you've been keeping it to yourself, but we need stories over time to build a generation of faith and people who are going to follow Jesus. That's what we're called to do. People in new spaces, new phases, they need the story of God's faithfulness, and they need a seat to know that they belong to the family of God and to the community of God's people. That's what we're called to be. Not just for our own family, but for one another. That's what a tribe does. And everybody needs that, every family, no matter what phase of family you are in, even as an individual, you need that. So where's the open seat for you? What open seat are you creating for someone else? Can you just imagine what that would be like for everybody to have a seat, for everybody to belong? People that you work with who maybe feel kind of lost, that maybe feel like, I don't really have my people. Come on. I have found this place to belong. And there's a seat for you. Man, I'm going through this really difficult season in my life. I understand that. I haven't been through that myself, but let me explain to you God's faithfulness in my life. Let me share my story with you. What happens when we do that for those people around us, for our family, for our kids, for students? Everybody needs that. And Jesus demonstrated it for us. So let's not keep it to ourselves. Let's share that and make this dark world a very bright place. Will you pray with me? God, thank you for these things that over time radically shape a family's life, an individual's life, the heart of a kid. God, thank you for the story of Jesus. Thank you for putting it into our hearts. Some of us can't imagine a time without that story. God, thank you for your faithfulness, how you show up again and again. God, thank you for giving us a seat at the table, a place to belong, people that extend forgiveness and grace to us, and for giving us the opportunity to extend grace and forgiveness to others. Or we don't have to mask, we don't have to try to be something we're not, we can just be who we are, and you call us to take steps of obedience to be more like you. God, help us this week and throughout the year as we look to what time we have left, to have a seat at the table where others can belong, to have stories to share of your faithfulness, that we would have a perspective beyond ourselves that sees to the heart of people, to the heart of God. We love you, Jesus. In your name we pray.